Hey class, so today we're going to talk about the neurophysiology of the motor system. So here's just an example of the lower body muscles within our motor system. So we have three types of movement. We have reflexive, which is going to be more involuntary. It's very fast, okay, can have a response in about 30 milliseconds. There's voluntary muscular contraction, takes a little bit longer, about 200 milliseconds. But our goal is that we improve with practice through experiences, and we can learn from that to improve reaction time. Then we have rhythmic activity. This is going to be something like walking that we'll talk about later on in another lecture. It's a combination of reflexive and voluntary movements. Walking, chewing, scratching. So it's voluntary to initiate, but then usually involuntary to carry out. And we'll talk about central pattern generators with walking that kind of help carry out our movement during that action. So reflexes are involuntary and stereotypic response to a stimulus. Okay, it's usually unconscious. It's the building blocks for more complex movements. We have non-invasive diagnostics for this. That would be something like our stretch reflex, hitting the patellar tendon, watching the knee extend. Can be a long loop or a short loop in terms of communication. So reflexes are intrasegmental within one level of the spinal cord. That would be like our stretch reflex, which is something that we'll talk about today. They can be intersegmental, which involves more than one spinal cord level, something like the scratch reflex, meaning when you feel an itch, you have to scratch it. And then brainstem reflexes, something like eye blinking or the gag reflex. So they can also be monosynaptic or polysynaptic. When we're talking about monosynaptic, it's communication between only two neurons, so there's one synapse, and it cannot be eliminated. So we have basically a sensory neuron that communicates with a motor neuron and tells the muscle to contract. Then we have polysynaptic, which would be more than two neurons, so it would be like a response to a noxious stimulus, can be controlled or overridden. So say you're touching something hot, the reflex is to pull your arm away, meaning there's one excitatory pathway that activates motor neurons that innervate kind of those same side flexor muscles, which draw your arm away from that noxious stimulus. Okay, and another pathway is stimulated that excites motor neurons that innervate those opposite side extensor muscles, which provide support while you withdraw the limb. So there's several neurons communicating. Now the stretch reflex, the muscle contractions that occur when the muscle is lengthened. So we're talking about our muscle spindles. They're sensitive to stretch. The spindles will send information about stretch to the spinal cord. So an afferent neuron synapses directly onto an alpha motor neuron and causes a contraction. So you can see our muscle spindles, which are intrafusal muscle fibers. They contract in parallel with muscle fibers. They do not contract as hard as our extrafusal muscle fibers. And they're not innervated by alpha motor neurons. They're innervated by gamma motor neurons. And the muscle spindles end up sensing change in length. Okay, so they sense muscle length and velocity. So here's just another picture of the muscle spindles. So talking about the stretch reflex, we can see that if we hit the patellar tendon, there's a sensory signal that travels up the leg to the spinal cord, and then eventually you'll see in purple that we get, that we'll see in black. No, we see it in green. It's going the other way, so you guys can see the arrow. Sorry, mixed that one up. Okay, we see the green is going to end up causing a contraction, and then we see the communication of the hamstrings to not contract. So we see that antagonistic muscle get shut down. So the intrafusal fibrils in the muscle spindle, okay, they don't contribute a lot to force production. I said they mainly sense that stretch. They do help a little bit with contraction, but not a whole heck of a lot. Then we have the extrafusal fibers, which are outside of the spindle. We already mentioned the difference between the alpha and gamma motor neurons. We can have alpha-gamma coactivation, which, the more motor neurons that we have firing, the alpha motor neurons and the gamma neurons, we're going to have a greater strength of contraction. With that stretch reflex, I mentioned that the hamstring shut down. We call that reciprocal innervation, meaning the agonist muscle will contract, the quads, but the antagonistic muscles will be relaxed, meaning the hamstrings will not fire. What's great about muscle spindles is that we can have some type of pre-tensing, or what we call we can bias our muscle spindles by tensing the intrafusal muscle fibers. So you might have tried to catch a ball before, someone threw a football at you, or maybe you got really scared because someone said heads up and you went to catch something. So when the gamma system is activated, remember, activates our intrafusal muscle fibers, tenses those intrafusal muscle fibers, and keeps the muscle spindle loaded, allowing us to respond to externally applied muscle stretch, again called the gamma bias. So we're now, if we were going to go catch that ball, we're now more sensitive to the stretch placed on our hands or arms when we're catching. And what's awesome is that, again, this is not the stretch reflex, but we're able to co-contract both agonist and antagonistic muscles, which is useful for the precision and joint stabilization that is critical for catching a ball. We need to be able to contract faster, and we need to stabilize. I mean, if we can pre-tense both agonist and antagonistic muscles, we're going to be very prepared for catching that ball. Now we have the H reflex. So this is similar to the stretch reflex, but we're bypassing that muscle tendon communication. So bypasses the muscle spindle. Typically we do this in the soleus, is where we'll see it most often. Measures reflex latency, communication, and it could give us some signs of disease or neuropathy depending on whether or not there's a hypoactive or there's an absence of signal. So the H reflex, electrical impulse is applied to nerve, will stimulate both the IA afferent neurons, okay, from the muscle spindle, as well as the alpha motor neurons. So the IA afferent neurons are larger and have a lower threshold, so we can actually stimulate these, and why it's essential for precision and placement of these electrodes is because we can stimulate at a very low threshold these IA afferents and cause a small muscular contraction. And what we'll end up seeing is we'll see the H reflex, or we'll see an F wave, okay, is the muscle twitch that will occur. So we'll send a signal, there will be a latent period, so it follows a reflex arc, the IA afferent synapses on the alpha motor neuron, and then we see a little contraction. Now if this stimulus is too great, okay, the alpha motor neuron fires a lot sooner, okay, and we could kind of bypass this IA afferent synapse. Because we know that alpha motor neurons need to hit a certain threshold in order to contract, if we're hitting that threshold, we'll actually see the H reflex start to dwindle down. So here's just a picture of it. To put it all into perspective, you'll see the little kind of bump on the M, that's the M wave, that's the muscle contracting. And then we also see the H wave, again, that's the muscle contracting after a little bit of a latent period as well. So I want you guys to put this a little bit more clearly. Think of this like a muscle stim unit kind of lab. If we place the electrodes properly and stimulate the IA afferent sensory neuron, it will send a signal causing causing a signal. It will send a signal causing the muscle to briefly contract, which is the H reflex. Apologize for the confusion there. So if we place the electrodes properly, stimulate that IA afferent sensory neuron, it will send a signal causing the muscle to briefly contract, which is that H reflex. The reason we see that little M and then an H wave in the graph in that upper left is that with if the electrical stimulation is high, it automatically causes the muscle to contract. And then later, there will be a sensory signal that finally communicates with the motor neuron, and another small contraction occurs. Again, this reflex depends a lot on placement and stimulation of the electrodes. Okay, it's just showing us another way that these intrafusal fibers sense a stimulus and cause a contraction. What's really interesting, though, is that the magnitude of the H reflex is dependent upon experience. Meaning if someone, so for the soleus, they find that ballet dancers have a very small H reflex, okay, which makes sense and tells us a lot about motor learning. So it suggests that we have modification of spinal reflexes being an important process in learning motor skills. And to kind of go back to things that could be of issues, that if we don't have this reflex, okay, it may be associated with some sort of issue within the sensory or motor axons, the cell bodies of motor neurons, maybe even the muscle itself. But it could also potentially tell us if we need to dig deeper further into examining lesions of the central nervous system. So now moving on to voluntary movement. There's a hierarchy. We have our cerebral cortex, which is the highest top level of control. We have topographical mappings of little areas of the brain of what does what in certain areas. Then it goes down to the basal ganglia, thalamus, cerebrum, okay, where we'll see corollary discharge. Then it'll go down to spinal cord, then to the alpha motor neurons. So the premotor cortex, okay, prepares muscles for upcoming events. So it receives information from the sensory cortex, and it fires before the primary cortex because its main role is planning movement. So premotor cortex first for planning, then the supplementary motor area is second for programming. So think of it like shaking a hand. We plan our handshake first, okay, and then initiate our handshake second. You just got to hope someone doesn't just grab your fingers, because then it just ruins the entire handshake. Now, if we have a lesion to the premotor cortex, this would be like people that might have suffered from a stroke. The patient knows what to do, but cannot plan or program it. So there's also apraxia, in which no sensory loss or weakness, but cannot perform complex actions. Meaning we have issues with that planning. We know what to do. We're like, oh, but we can't tell just like maybe shaking a hand, we can't tell our hand how to shake. And we're talking about muscle fibers, we're talking about voluntary movement, skeletal muscle contracting, we have to talk about motor units. So a motor unit is an alpha motor neuron and the muscle fibers that it innervates. It's the all or none principle. Either everything's going to contract or none at all. Remember, we have to hit a certain threshold, electrical threshold, for contraction to occur. If we don't hit that threshold, then no contraction occurs. And that's the all or none principle. And so to give you guys a little idea of the number of muscle fibers, it depends on the muscle function. So the platysma, which overlaps the sternocleidomastoid in the neck, has a bunch of neurons, okay, few muscle fibers, okay, 25-to-1 ratio. It's a little bit more detailed, complex movements, okay. Biceps brachii has less neurons but more muscle fibers. Medial gastroc has the fewest amount of neurons but the most muscle fibers, because you gotta think, we're walking every single day. We need a lot of those muscle fibers to contract, and contract hard. Now the motor unit, the fibers of a motor unit may be scattered throughout the muscle, okay, and when we recruit, okay, muscle, it's based off the Henneman size principle. So we recruit small, slow twitch motor units first, followed by the larger, fast twitch motor units second. So think we're kind of recruit slow twitch muscles and then fast twitch muscles, because it would be highly inefficient to say I'm picking up something really light to fire my fast twitch motor units, because those are going to be stronger and more powerful when it's just a really light cup. So the motor units in a muscle are not all activated at the same time. Okay, the nervous system rotates the motor units and muscle fibers that are active to maintain a constant force and limit fatigue. Again, the efficiency of our motor units in terms of movement. Now the contraction itself starts with the muscle fiber. We understand that there's a twitch, then we have summation, and then we have tetanus, and we see that the muscle is not allowed to relax between action potentials. And when we get that muscle contraction, multiple motor units together will combine to produce a force. We increase force by recruiting more motor units, increasing the frequency of action potentials. And now to wrap this up, I got 10 seconds talking about the GTO located in the tendons, and it's responsible for sensing tension within the muscle and can cause it to shut down.